Why is the Feywild always the woods, but with the tint skewed more towards the purple? What's fascinating to me is that the Feywild is this crazy, whimsical wild place where kind of anything is possible, but we always tend to run it as a dungeon crawl in the forest with some unique enemies. And I think there's a lot of room for some exciting stuff in there, so let's talk about the Feywild and running a one-shot or a chapter or an entire game in this Fey-tastic plane. See what I did there? To understand the history of the Feywild, we have to look at how different cultures categorized the unknown and the things that they feared back in the day, or I guess you do if you're like me. And it's important to note that all of these mythologies didn't come from a single fixed place or a specific timeline. These stories evolved over thousands of years and vary wildly by region. Now, one of the earliest foundations comes from ancient Greece and the concept of animism. And animism is the belief that objects, places, and creatures all possess a distinct spiritual essence. In this view, nature isn't just scenery, it's like this living, sentient, breathing thing. And the Greeks represented this through beings like nymphs, which were these spirits that were tied to specific natural features, like dryads for trees and naiads for water. I think there's sort of like distinctions between like fresh water and rivers and the ocean, so close enough. And then they also had satyrs, which are commonly seen in a lot of media and movies and TV shows, who represented the untamed, the hedonistic side of the wilds, the leaning into the pleasures of life. These weren't necessarily monsters that had to be hunted, but were kind of like the owners of the land that humans had to negotiate with or interact with. And as we move into the Gaelic traditions, we see the shift towards this idea of a hidden society. This is centered on the doesnt, a race of godlike beings from the Book of Invasions. Now, according to the myths in this book, they were defeated in a war by the Milesians, who are basically the ancestors of modern humans. Now, at the end of this battle, there was a treaty that was supposedly struck between the Milesians and the doesnt. What they settled on was that humans would take the surface and the doesnt would take the world below. They became known as the Eastshi, or the people of the mounds, because they were thought to live inside the Shi, or the ancient burial mounds on the earthen hills that are kind of found across the landscape. So this created the concept of this overlapping reality, that there's this world and then there's the world right under our feet that operates by different rules because the supernatural lives there. Now, whether these Gaelic ideas developed on their own or were influenced by the Roman Empire's expansion is literally still debated by historians. When the Romans arrived in Britain, they used a practice called interpretatio Romana, which was essentially just translating the local spirits into Roman gods that they already understood, because it made it easier to assimilate those peoples as they conquered them. So because of this blending of traditions, we really start to see the Fae less as mysterious neighbors and more as a structured hierarchy that they could then categorize. So this need to categorize the Fae eventually led to the famous divide that we find in like the Lowland Scots and the Northern English folklore, the Seelie and the Unseelie courts. Now, the word Seelie comes from the Old English Seili or Selig, meaning blessed or lucky. Now, the Seelie court is generally described as the blessed group. They were social. They might help humans who follow their strict etiquette. They were just overall seen as kind of friendlier. And then there's the Unseelie or unblessed, and these were often associated with the Sla or the unforgiven dead. Those who were seen as more malevolent. They were flying creatures that would prey on people. So while modern media often depicts this as good versus evil, in older folklore, it's actually suggested that it's more about like the socially bound versus the socially hostile. So neither side followed human morality. They followed their own rules and regulations among their society. And it's just one was more likely to attack you than the other. Now, to understand how we got from medieval folklore to a 1970s tabletop game, we have to look at the middleman, which is that Victorian and Edwardian eras. Because between the ancient myths and Gary Gygax, there was a massive revival of interest in the supernatural that reshaped how we visualize these creatures to this day. So writers like Shakespeare had already started shrinking the Fae into like these whimsical flower dwellers back in the 1600s. But it was the Victorians who really obsessed over categorizing them. They treated the folklore like a science. So just as they were mapping out the animal kingdom, they were trying to build a taxonomy of the supernatural. So you have people like Andrew Lang, scholars, I'm talking about actual scholars, or members of the folklore society that began documenting these oral traditions and all of this folklore as like structured types of creatures. So if you want a really good example, you can check out an Encyclopedia of Fairies by Catherine Briggs, which was basically like a monster manual precursor. And this obsession with classification provided that raw data that then 20th century authors like Tolkien and Poul Anderson would later use to build their fantasy worlds. Now, by the time Gary Gygax was developing D&D, along with Dave Arneson, they weren't really looking at old myths. They were looking at a century's worth of encyclopedia that had already turned the Fae from these invisible forces of nature into a list of specific creatures that already kind of had their own stats and weaknesses and habitats. So I guess the TLDR there is that writers and poets began to romanticize the Fae, moving them away from being these like terrifying invisible forces and toward the fairy tale aesthetic that we recognize now. This era gave us the idea of Fae having distinct physical traits like gossamer wings and the pointed ears and the little sizes, and that wasn't a feature in the original legends. So Dungeons and Dragons eventually pulled all these ideas together. In early editions, that setting was called the Plane of Fairy and was treated like a standard magical dimension. It wasn't until 4th edition that the term Feywild was coined and the plane echo concept was established. This took the Gaelic idea of a hidden overlapping world and made it a literal reflection of the material plane. So in 5th edition, the focus shifted towards the idea of archfey and that sort of thing, which we can see in The Wild Beyond the Witchlight. So this means that the plane is no longer just a location with trees and hills, but it's a dimension that reacts to the emotion and to the story. So what I mean is if a player feels deep grief, then the environment might respond with literal rain or wilting plants. And you see this a lot in Wild Beyond the Witchlight. Now what's important to note is that in 5e lore, the Feywild is a reflection of the material plane. Like I said, it's a mirror. So if you look at this image from the DMG, you can see that the Shadowfell is sort of the negative of the material. So that would mean that the Feywild is the positive, but also like not really. I like to think of it more like 3 layers of the same thing, like a trisection, I guess, if that's a word, which I'm sure it is. They're almost identical, just one is dark and grim and one is wild and chaotic, and then there's the material plane that is like the gooey center. So hopefully that gives us an understanding of how we got the Fey and how we learned to define it, but what about getting to the Feywild? Well, in D&D, this is usually handled by high-level magic like the plane shift spell. But if you want your game to feel like actual folklore, getting there should, I think, be more of an accident of circumstances or an adventure in its own way, like a puzzle or an interaction or something. Now, in the lore, these are called Fey crossings or Fey gates. These are spots where the veil between the material plane and the Feywild is thin. Usually it's at a location that is the mirror of its counterpart, where they line up almost exactly. So maybe they share the same lake or the same mountain. A good example of this might be a perfectly circular grove of mushrooms, or a reflection in a pond that doesn't quite match the sky, or a stone archway that only appears when the sun hits at a certain angle. But to make it even more complicated, you could also have a Fey crossing require a key or a specific condition that needs to be met, like that archway. And I think a good example of that is sort of like knowing the Elvish word for friend, and you speak it in front of it. The key usually is not actually a key, it's like an action or an item. You might have to walk through the archway backwards, or you have to carry a piece of iron, or you have to be humming a specific tune. Or the condition, which could mean that maybe it only opens during liminal time, so those moments that are neither here nor there. So like twilight, which is between day and night, or New Year's, which is between years, or the exact moment of a solar eclipse, which is between light and dark. Now, whatever the case, you can come up with your own way of getting there. That's a whole fun thing in itself. You can do like a well, like in Inuyasha, or a tunnel like in Spirited Away, whatever you want. It's the Fae. Literally, almost anything makes sense. This is where you can really mess with your players' heads. They shouldn't always know that they've crossed over immediately. That mystery, I think, is part of the fun. So maybe the forest just starts to look a little too colorful, a little too green, or the birds are too intelligent, like they're watching them. But for a one-shot or a campaign, nothing beats the classic wrong turn. You know, you follow a white stag into a thicket that you're hunting, and when you turn around, you look at the path that you came from, but it's gone, and the trees have eyeballs. But what does the Feywild actually look like? Is it mushrooms? Is it weird colored trees? Is it just a forest? Now, if we lean into the history we just covered, the look depends entirely on the tone and genre you choose for your game. So it's not just a place, it's also a narrative lens. A lens in the sense that like you kind of look through it and cast the tone and genre through that lens. So if you're going for a dark and gothic vibe like the Brothers Grimm, then you're probably going to lean into like that forest, that medieval life, that muskets and pitchforks type of vibe, where it just feels very much like Maleficent with like the gnarled roots and the shadows and the dark forest, that sort of vibe. If you prefer surreal horror, then you're playing into the uncanny valley, where things look almost right. The trees might have bark that looks a little bit too much like human skin, or the birds will mimic the voices of the players or of their loved ones. Geometry doesn't quite make sense, like you're walking towards a mountain for 3 hours, but it's staying the same size. Things feel almost dreamlike. like that sort of thing. If you're going for like whimsical gaming, and this is I think more like Alice in Wonderland, then it's a realm of the absurd that, you know, focuses on like ego and law. Things are loud and nonsensical, so you have these giant mushrooms and flowers that talk to you. The sky can change colors, the mood can change very quickly. So I guess in that sense, the danger there is more like, you know, if you think of like the Queen of Hearts, where it's not that you're gonna get bitten by a monster or attacked on the road, it's more of like breaking a social rule that you didn't know existed. And it can be very deeply frustrating for characters who need to rely on that common sense. And I mean the character itself, not necessarily the player. So that can you can lean into a lot of really fun social interactions there. And then if you're looking for something a little more ethereal, a little more whimsical, but less wild like that, and more watercolor, I guess is the word that comes to mind for me, then you can get really heavily inspired by like Studio Ghibli, for example, which focuses on like the spirits of the land and that quiet wonder. And, you know, the Feywild here could be breathtaking and beautiful, and you have floating islands and rivers of light and moss-covered ruins. Not everything's necessarily hostile, it's just different to humans. Then you can, you know, lean into that sort of aspect of it, because that still is kind of Feywild. I think the key to making the Feywild more than just a forest crawl is to pick one tone and kind of let it dictate the visuals, one lens. That's a great place to like ask your players what kind of Fey world do they find interesting. That way you're not just giving them glowing purple mushrooms and a dark forest. Now once they're there, once they're in the Feywild, then we need to look at things from a sense of narrative logic. It's not physical logic. The things that are happening are not based on things that make sense in a physical world anymore, is what I mean. So how do you do that? How do you chart things that don't work? How do you chart the impossible? Well, let's talk about emotions. In the Feywild, the map is not necessarily a territory. It's this ever-changing thing. The borders will shift. The landmarks will be moving. Again, we talked about mountains not getting closer. So things just don't make sense in the Feywild. But what you do have is mood. So mood is the territory. That's what lets the players know whether they're doing something correctly or incorrectly. The Feywild acts as this like emotional mirror to them. In lore, I mean, it doesn't just surround your players, it literally gets inside of them. So it is the players. If the environment is reacting off of them, it will reflect their internal state. So if your players are having a heated argument, then that forest crawl becomes more difficult. The thorns start to grow on the road, the path gets narrow, the trees close in, you might get attacked by something. But if you have a moment where the bard is inspired and they're playing this jaunty tune, and then the literal geography of the forest can flatten out and make their walk easier. And it's fun watching the players discover that like sense of like that is very Alice in Wonderland, that you kind of are manipulating the landscape, because if you don't tell them right away, it takes a little bit for it to catch on for them, which I think is really fun. Now, what that looks like in the game is that in a normal session, usually players have to rely on a very specific set of skills to navigate the world. So they might use survival to find a path, or stealth to avoid a threat, or strength to break an obstacle. But in the Feywild, those skills become erratic because they're designed for a world that stays still, that has rules. And as we've established, the Feywild uses a completely different set of rules. In a normal forest, a high survival roll will find north or the path or whatever. But in the Feywild, a high survival roll might instead find the direction of the nearest person who can help you, which then leads them to a side quest or a town or a hook or whatever. If you try to use stealth, you might find that you can't hide behind the tree because that tree is gossiping about your location. But if you roll high in charisma, then you didn't make the tree upset, and maybe it actually kind of liked you and chose to hide you. That takes us to time and space, because that subjectivity extends to time and distance as well. Spending 2 nights in the Feywild does not mean that 2 nights back home have gone by. And you could spot a castle a mile away in the distance and walk all night and it never gets closer, like we talked about. This becomes really apparent the moment they get back to the material plane, because what I like to call is like the Fey hangover. When the players finally leave, all of that time catches up to them in an unpredictable way. That's the classic folklore trope, right? Where a night in the Feywild turns out to be like 70 years in the mortal world. By making time and distance untrustworthy to the players, you're kind of stripping away that mechanical safety net, and makes it so that when they go to the Feywild for a quote day, what they're getting into is not necessarily what they might be expecting, because they might get lost. They might not know a way back, and they have no idea what's waiting for them when they do get back. Now in 5e, there's very little mention of the Fey in terms of like laws and rules and structures. There's a lot of little vague mentions here and there, especially with Wild Beyond the Witchlight, which I think all that means is that ultimately you as a DM have a lot more freedom when it comes to actually running the game. So everything from this point forward we can call part 2, because this is all going to be more like a pick and choose buffet of Feywild madness for you. So just know that going forward, none of this is like set in stone. It's just my take or my ideas that I'm just kind of spewing out at you. So editor, make a giant part 2 fly over me, but like really slow. Like it's massive, like the Death Star, like the Star Destroyer. I know my Star Wars. And add like epic music right now. And now it's flying overhead. It's so beautiful. Okay, so let's talk game. If you want your Feywild to feel cohesive, you need framework. I think so. I think you need rules. Now, again, while there are no set rules that I could find, there are some core rules, or laws, I guess we can call them, that are commonly found in folklore and media and other TTRPG sources. Now, these are rules that I think are useful, so again, feel free to skip this part. I'll put on the screen what time the next section starts, but if you find them useful, steal them. Now, the first rule or law is reciprocity. This is the nothing is free rule. In our world, saying thank you is just being polite, but in the Feywild, words are like currency. A thank you is a verbal receipt. It's like a formal admission that you have received something of value and now you owe a debt in return. So if a player says thank you to a Fey, they've essentially handed over an open-ended IOU that the Fey can cash in whenever they want. This is how you get those classic stories of someone like selling their voice for a single favor, or like Fey creatures screwing over the recipient for that gift or that contract. Now, the second law is hospitality. And I think this is the protection that keeps the Feywild from being a constant bloodbath, because otherwise I feel like with how the Fey are, they would just devolve into like the abyss or the hells. So I think this law makes sense because it gives them a why. We're not animals, we live in a society. So while you're a guest in a Fey's home, you are sacred. The host cannot harm you and you cannot harm the host. However, I think that it's fun to make this sort of like a legal minefield, because the moment a guest is rude, which could be as simple or mundane as like staying past your welcome, then that protection is void. And at that point, the host is legally allowed to treat you like a trespasser and throw you out or fight you or whatever. And I think this one's fun because it turns every social interaction into like a high stakes puzzle, like a role-playing thing where they just are super careful about what they say. Now, the third law is the law of the name, and this is your classic Rumpelstiltskin. In the Feywild, identity is kind of like a physical object, so the name is power. If you learn a Fey's true name, you can command them. You have power over them. So learning their name means that, you know, you want to protect your name and you don't want other people to know it, so you have weird names like Rumpelstiltskin. Actually, wait, that didn't work because Rumpelstiltskin is their name. Whatever, you get what I'm saying. Now, there's the rule of food and drink, and this is kind of like the ultimate point of no return. Historically, and we've seen this come up in lots of movies and stuff, the only one I can think of is Pan's Labyrinth, but also Spirited Away. So if you eat the food of the Fae, you belong to the Fae, basically. Mechanically, this can mean the player can no longer get home, or like Chihiro and Spirited Away, it wipes their memories. Or you can let them eat their cake, and then when they get home, they realize that they can't find nourishment in real food, mortal food. Or even worse, they're like magically compelled to return to the Feywild, so every time they fall asleep, they wake up and they realize that they've been sleepwalking, and it just gets farther and farther away. Then there's the law of iron, and that's perhaps the most famous physical law of the Fae, I guess. In folklore, iron, specifically cold iron, is anathema to the supernatural. Iron represents the cold, hard, industrial reality of the mortal world, and it acts as a grounding force that disrupts magic. So carrying iron into the Feywild is often seen as a declaration of war or an act of extreme aggression. Mechanically, you can treat iron like a dead magic zone for any Fey that's like within 5 feet of it or whatever. It's a great way to give your martial players like a specialized tool because they have like this advantage. Maybe it gets rid of some of the natural resistances, like magical resistance. If you use an iron sword, it gets rid of their resistance or something, right? But it comes with the social cost of every Fey around you hating you and treating you like you're carrying a warhead. And then finally, I think the rule of 3, and I think this is like a narrative logic rule. In the Feywild, the world likes patterns, so things happen in threes. So, you know, like Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice. You have 3 sisters to a coven. You have 3 bridges, 3 riddles. If a player asks a question twice and gets the same answer, then maybe the third time they ask, that answer becomes permanent or like a cosmic truth, even if it was a lie. So you can use that to kind of reward players who think creatively, but you can also use it to punish players if, you know, things are getting too repetitive. So you have an understanding of what kinds of laws you might want to put into the world, but what about the people? Well, let's take a quick look at Feywild politics. Now, when you're building your Feywild, you'll eventually run into the big political divide. You have the courts, and most DMs use the summer and the winter, or the Seelie and the Unseelie, which we talked about. But there is actually a fascinating, really historical distinction between them that can give your world a lot more depth, and you can kind of choose or mix. The Seelie court, like we talked earlier, comes from the word for blessed, and historically, these were the Fae that humans thought they could actually talk to. They were kind of like the aristocracy of the spirit world. They had a code of honor, they had these grand processions, and they were generally hospitable provided that you didn't offend them. And then the Unseelie court were, you know, the swarm of restless spirits that flew through the night. They were actively hostile to humans. They didn't have a ruling body. They were just this chaotic, malevolent force. And then summer and winter courts are a slightly newer, more literary concept that gained massive popularity through Victorian romanticism and modern fantasy. And in this system, the courts aren't necessarily about good versus evil. Instead, they represent the cycle of nature. So summer is the court of growth, of heat, of passion, life. Winter is the court of cold, silence, hunger, survival. The summer and winter distinction is more tied to the solar festivals of the Celts, so Beltane and Samhain. But in many modern D&D settings, people combine them. Also, I think I said Samhain, right? Samhain? Samhain? Is it both? Sometimes it's both. Summer becomes the Seelie court and winter becomes the Unseelie court, but you don't have to do that. You could have a summer Unseelie court, so like relentless burning heat wave that kills the crops and drives people to madness, or a winter Seelie court that's this like peaceful snowy wonderland, and you could do something really fun with that for the Christmas one shot that you want to run or whatever. You could have a Seelie winter knight who's cold and terrifying but would never break his word, or a summer Unseelie sprite who is bright and beautiful but just wants to watch the world burn. As your players are navigating the politics and as they're walking through the land, something that you can do that's really fun is use the environment, use interactions to change them. The Fey realms are really powerful magic, so it only makes sense that it would start to manifest in physical ways. Now, if that sounds fun to you, you can scan this QR code. You can go to the link down below, either one. I made a little table for a D100 roll, and it's got a bunch of different effects that you might want to give to your players. Again, completely free. You don't need to sign up or do anything. Like literally, it's just right there. So if you want it, it's there. Just thought it'd be fun. Now, remember the courts here will probably behave differently. So you have powerful and wild rulers in power. So Titania is a great example. She might be the heart of your summer court, and in her presence the world is lush and vibrant. I mean, she's the queen of the fairies, right? But she isn't necessarily a good queen. Her love is like wildfire. It can be charismatic, all-consuming. She might even be suffocating, and she might decide that you are so charming and cute that you deserve to be preserved in her court forever. And in her mind, that's an act of ultimate kindness. And that's just one character. Imagine a whole royal court of people like that. It can take that whimsy and really make it feel dangerous. Now, in the material plane, kings want land. They want gold. They want spice roots. They want power, right? But in the Feywild, they have power. Everything is power. Everything is magic. So that's where you get to have fun and determine if the land is teeming with supernatural power, what would the inhabitants want instead? More power? This is what makes them dangerous, I think, even if they are pretty or chaotic or fun to look at or fun to roleplay. A Fey is a creature that is obsessed with things that are finite and rare. Memories, emotions, legacies. These are the things that give them real power in this realm because it is something that cannot be purchased, something that cannot be replaced. The more they amass, the more power they get, and when you amass enough power, they become what is called an archfey, which is basically something between a fairy and a god, or a fairy and a god and a demigod, or a fairy and a demigod. I don't know. They're basically really powerful fae, okay? An archfey might not want your gold, but they might want the memory of your first kiss, or the color of your eyes, or the feeling of your greatest victory. And those things are really fun as role-playing anchors. These archfey become collectors of things that cannot be conjured by magic, because in this realm, that's the rarest thing, because everything is magic, and when everything is magic,
no one will be.
So to pull off an archfey, you have to treat your archfey as more than just a high-level NPC with some fancy stat block. You can think of them as beings that are so ancient and powerful that their mood dictates the environment, much like the players. So if an archfey is jealous, then the roses in their garden might grow thorns and scream at you. They are the personification of the Feywild. They are the ones that are kind of building it, making it what it is. So meeting one should feel like that. When your players stand in front of an archfey, you want your players to realize that they are dealing with a mind of a being that functions on a completely different frequency, because the Feywild is a different frequency. So I think the Mad Hatter is a great example. Imagine him ruling a castle, or the Queen of Hearts, where they're just slightly off. And of course, the Archfey doesn't live in a vacuum, so let's talk about everybody else, or the commoners. They are surrounded by the common Fey. This is where your genre and your tone really shines, because by changing how these groups interact with the party, you're really changing the feel of the world. So I think that their roles and their personalities should really shift to drastically match the world's specific flavor. So if you're in a gothic grim fantasy, then players are expecting high stakes and a dark tone, right? So the world is going to feel older and heavier, maybe a bit more dangerous. So you have humans, and then you have fey creatures out in the wilds, more like the tall tales, like dangerous beings like werewolves and goblins and things like that. And anything that's non-human might be seen as lesser. So you have goblins in the wilds that are like scavenger blacksmiths, and they're industrious and they're obsessive and they're cast out and they're exiles, and maybe they're not all evil, but they're beings that are forced into lives of evil because of society. And you might have satyrs that are these like wild-eyed, hairy fey people that will like maybe guide you through the woods, but they get mad at you if you step on like the roots. And then the red caps, which are kind of like the teeth of the forest. They're like the twisted ones, the corrupted ones. They're the reason you don't go into the forest. But if you're doing like Alice in Wonderland, then your players are expecting absurdity and nonsense. So you can do a lot with like anthropomorphized creatures like the white rabbit. You might meet a centaur that instead of like it being like this wild thing, it's just another day to meet a centaur, but they're like a royal messenger and they're really pissed that you're making them late for delivering the thing. And goblins maybe aren't outcasts, they're just servants. And then again, there's the whole ethereal vibe, right? If you want to do more like Ghibli and leaning into the spirits and using nymphs and dryads and animals, and you can do a whole fey horror thing and lean into the blights and skeletons and specters and vampires and shadow druids and hags. Again, all of that is up to you and how you want to lean into the world of this fey run, right? That you're doing. Fey run, like a fey run. I'm not saying fey rune wrong. Don't come at me. Which takes us to sort of the last leg of this video, and that's the look, like literal geography. Now, technically, the Feywild is a duplicate of the material world. So it has the same continents, it has the same landmarks, almost exactly, right? Like just a little warped. So if the upside down in Stranger Things is the Shadowfell, then the Feywild is the upside up, right side up, up, down, up, left, right, up, down. Now, what you decide to put into your Fey world will say a lot about the type of place that it is, and that comes down to geography as well. So for example, if your players discover a river, they might come to various conclusions, right? If you see a river as part of the landscape, that tells you a lot of things. This river goes from somewhere to somewhere. So it's a place that's wild, sure, it's different, sure, like the trees look weird, right? Because it's the Feywild, but there's light, there's water, there's purity, so maybe there's a settlement. But if they're in a place of endless trees, that will make them feel suffocated and trapped and isolated, right? So thinking about what you're going to place as landmarks does change and alter the way that players think about things. So just food for thought. So to help you, here's a few landmarks I think would be fun, and maybe it'll get your gears turning. So like I said, a river, but like a magical river, because in D&D, the river Styx from the Nine Hells is a great example of a river that does something. It literally wipes your memory and can cause essentially the effects of a Feeble Mind spell if you don't make a DC 20 save. And that's if it doesn't kill you, because the average person would die just upon drinking or touching its waters. So in the Feywild, you can play with that concept without making it an absolute memory wipe. Maybe it changes the color of their skin or their race, or makes them see things that weren't there before, like spirits or road signs, like magical road signs. Literally, who knows? You do. Now, another fun location would be some sort of grove, like a big tree, like a sentient tree that can act as a guide or a deterrent. It can be wild and chaotic like the Cheshire Cat, or it can be helpful and nurturing like Grandmother Willow. And then an archfey tower, because come on, a giant mage's tower in the forest all covered in vines, and inside is some mad scientist shit show of a mage that could be really fun or really dangerous. Now, a stone circle is another one. This is your bread and butter Fey spot, I think. Like Stonehenge. It's in Narnia, it's in Pan's Labyrinth, we see it in Brave, which are all great examples of like a Fey-like setting. It could be a gateway, it can be a place where time stands still, or a neutral ground where the law of hospitality is magically enforced. It's a perfect place for a high-stakes meeting, like in Narnia. Obviously, a great capital city too, or a palace is a must if you really want to lean into that court system. But you can also think about the smaller villages too. You can have really wild, whimsical villages. You can have farmlands that grow crazy, never before seen food. You can have fields with beautiful flowers. You can have villages that float, villages that glow in the dark. I mean, just imagine the marketplaces that you would discover if you went to the Feywild. And then there's the things that live in those places, all of these locations, the landmarks that are your Fey encounters. And not necessarily combat. They can just be creatures that you meet, that you can speak to or barter with or fight. Yeah. But you can have things like dryads and nymphs, Fey dragons, which are adorable if you haven't seen them. Look at it. You have pixies, you can have giants. And if you're looking for darker combat, if you're looking for things that kind of lean into more of the horror, you have your ents and your blights. You have your will-o-wisps, which are actually little rambunctious shits. You have owlbears or giant animals, like you can just make an animal giant, like fighting some random giant sloth or something. Like that is a way to just kind of let your players know things are weird here. You have displacer beasts, hags. You could even do like a fun combat or chase encounter with a blink dog, where they're just trying to catch the damn thing and it's just blinking in and out of existence like they do, those cute, annoying, adorable little bastards. And if you want to play with some plants and just add some set dressing to the world, there's so many real world plants here right now that you can use as inspiration. And if they're not already weird enough, you can scale them up. You can make them bigger, give them a voice, or give them some weird effect. So instead of a blink dog, you can do like blink mushrooms. which is like a fungi that like teleports around and makes it really hard to gather potion stuff. But some real world plants for you that I found. I literally just did a quick Google. I'm gonna throw them up on here for you. You have your black bat flower. You have your lithops. You have your pseudolithos cubiformis, which I think is really funny because pseudo means like kind of, I think, or like similar, right? And then lithos means stone. So it's like, if you look at this thing, it's like, it's kind of like a rock, kind of like a cube rock. That's literally what they named it. Happy alien flower. And then the Hydnora africana. This thing is horrifying. Look at it. This is how I know there's aliens out there. This is how I know. And then you could even do some fun things like a flower that puffs out pollen that makes you find everything hilarious. And it's really great for like breaking tension, but it's really terrible if you're trying to hide or you can spike somebody else's drink for it. You can even start like a racketeering ring by bringing back the flowers by the crate load, and you go to a neighboring kingdom and you start a labor system, turning this flower into a powder, making millions off the sweat and tears of sentient vines that feel pain and touch, and maybe they just want to like braid your hair and they can communicate with you. You can have plants that give off light and communicate with each other. Anyways, okay, so we've talked about the history, we've talked about the lore, we've talked about how to get there, we've talked about the political system and the people, the plants, the animals that might live there. So that leaves the exit strategy, the getting home. Now, there's lots of ways to find portals back, and I guess you can say that they are just as varied as the portals there. But just like entering, you can set specific requirements in order to leave. There's conditions that they have to meet or keys that they need to find. You can also tack on conditions or tolls or curses, and the best one in my opinion is when the party gets home only to realize that while they were gone for a night, the material plane has moved on by a week or a month or a decade. And if you want to do something even more, you can also give them like a type of madness that makes them want to come back or something similar. I tried to include a few fun things on that table that you can download, so make sure to check that out. But the goal with all of this in this video is to give you a better place to start from, and maybe even a pick and choose list. So I don't know, use the tropes, build the foundation, let the player's actions determine how the landmarks in your place actually react, how the people react. Listen, at the end of the day in the Feywild, the only constant is that nothing is constant.
The only thing that does make sense is that nothing makes sense.
Literally the most fun thing about it is that. So just lean into that chaos and stop trying to make sense of the nonsense. As always, forge on, my friends. And remember, don't forget to paint the roses red.
Who's been painting my roses red?